She was handcuffed beside her own car, grieving, silent, and black. They called her suspicious. They ignored her name. But the woman they arrested wasn't just anyone. She was the mayor's mother. And the video of what happened next? It didn't just break the town. It exposed everything they tried to hide. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. It was just past 10:00 p.m. in Silver Creek, in a town that looked like it had been painted by memory. White fences, clipped hedges, the faint scent of wood smoke in the air. Mist hung low over Sycamore Lane, draping the street like a blanket pulled gently over the town's shoulders. Porch lights glowed in rhythmic rows. The houses were quiet, most of them dark, save for the occasional flicker of a late-night television or the soft golden pulse of a hallway lamp left on for someone who hadn't come home yet. The road itself was slick from an earlier rain, catching reflections from the street lamps that buzzed softly overhead. Pale orange halos shimmered on the wet asphalt, intertwined by the slow, deliberate movement of a single car. A gray Lincoln sedan crept along the curve of the lane. Inside it, Margaret Ellis drove with the poise of someone who'd done this road 1,000 times, one hand on the wheel, the other resting gently on the curve of her coat sleeve. Her posture was straight, her chin held just above the dash. Her eyes, focused ahead, didn't waver. She was 68 years old, with hair the color of first snow. It was swept up into a careful bun. Her coat was thick, gray, buttoned to the throat, and her dress, navy with small white pin dots, had been pressed just that morning. She wore pearl earrings, modest and real, a gift from her late husband nearly 30 years ago. Tonight she had worn them for him. He was the reason she was out so late, the reason her hands were still gloved even inside the car. Robert Ellis had passed exactly 1 week ago after 42 years of marriage and a quiet battle with cancer that he'd insisted wasn't worth making a fuss about. Tonight had been a vigil, candles, gospel, stories shared in the soft light of the church basement. 100 people showed up, maybe more. Margaret had thanked each one with a grace that seemed unshakable. But now, as she drove alone through the silence, her face told another story. A photo sat in the passenger seat beside her. It was framed in worn oak, the kind you'd find on a Sunday school bookshelf. Robert's face stared back at her, smiling, proud, wearing the suit he had once called his marching jacket. He'd worn it to City Hall protests, to weddings, and later to chemo appointments when he wanted to feel strong. Margaret glanced at the picture, just briefly, then turned her eyes back to the road. The interior of the car hummed softly with the sound of tires against wet pavement. No music, no talk radio, just the rhythm of movement and the ache of memory. She inhaled slowly, through her nose, the way she always did when she wanted to keep from crying. But a tear slipped free anyway. She didn't brush it away. They had marched together in the late 70s. Back then, Margaret had been the one with the bullhorn, Robert with the clipboard. She organized. He negotiated. Together they built youth programs, organized voter drives, started a legal aid fund for families who couldn't afford defense. Later she became a teacher, then a principal. Robert became the quiet mentor that half the town's kids seemed to turn to when things went wrong. And together they raised 3 children. One of them now sat in City Hall every day, Mayor Julian Ellis. But tonight, none of that seemed to matter. The candles had burned down, the crowd had gone home, and Margaret was left with silence. The kind of silence that felt bigger than grief, bigger than memory. She exhaled and turned down Cottonwood Drive. Her house was just 2 blocks ahead. That's when she saw the headlights. They appeared in her rearview mirror, steady, bright, close. Her posture didn't change, but something in her chest tightened. A patrol SUV. She recognized the shape. Square frame. LED bar across the roof. Dark grille. She told herself it was just a coincidence. Just a cruiser making rounds. It was late. Maybe the officer was headed home. Maybe they lived in the neighborhood. She'd lived long enough to know not to jump to conclusions. Still, her eyes flicked to the mirror again. The SUV stayed with her. She turned right onto Magnolia. The cruiser followed, left onto Juniper, still behind her. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened just slightly. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. Fear implied uncertainty. This wasn't that. This was recognition, familiarity, a memory as old as her first car and her first warning from her father. She slowed down and signaled. She made another turn, back onto Sycamore, this time closer to home. The cruiser made the turn too. Margareta glanced down at her dashboard. Her speed was just under the limit. She hadn't drifted. She hadn't braked suddenly. There was no reason, none, and still, she knew what was coming. She clicked on her hazard lights. The Lincoln slowed, then eased gently toward the curb beneath a sputtering streetlight. The beam overhead buzzed and flickered, on again, as if uncertain whether it should illuminate what was about to happen. She rolled down her window, just a few inches, then reached over, removed her wallet and registration from her purse, and laid them both neatly on the passenger seat beside her husband's photo. Her movements were slow, deliberate, practiced. She took a deep breath, exhaled once, then placed both hands squarely on the top of the steering wheel. The SUV pulled in behind her. The red and blue lights burst to life, scattering across the sidewalk, bouncing off parked cars, flashing in the windows of sleeping homes. The strobes made everything look like a crime scene, even the stillness. The neighborhood remained quiet. No doors opened, no curtains moved, but Margaret knew better. Someone always swashed. Whether they spoke up was another question entirely. A door slammed. Heavy boots hit the pavement. The figure approached quickly. No flashlight, yet no greeting, just footsteps cutting through the mist. Margaret stayed still. Her fingers gripped the wheel, but didn't tense. Her eyes remained forward. The sound grew louder, closer. Then a voice. "Driver, roll down your window." Margaret didn't flinch. She had already complied. The window was halfway down. She turned her head slowly. A white woman in her 30s stood just outside the doorframe. Blonde ponytail, uniform sharp, badge glinting in the light. The officer looked in without emotion, then raised a flashlight and aimed it directly into Margaret's face. "License and registration." Margaret didn't move. She pointed gently to the seat beside her. "They're right there, officer." The woman didn't reach for them. Instead, she stared, for 1 second too long. "What brings you to this neighborhood tonight?" Margaret blinked once. Her voice came calm. "I live here, 2 blocks over, just heading home from a vigil." "Vigil?" the officer echoed. "My husband, he passed last week." The flashlight flickered slightly, then steadied. The officer's jaw clenched. "Georgia plates. When did you move here?" 3 months ago, to be near my son." Margaret didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. There was another pause. Then the officer's posture changed. The flashlight dropped just slightly. Her stance shifted from suspicious to tactical. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Marguerite didn't answer right away. "Is there a reason for that?" The officer's tone sharpened, voice louder now. "Man, step out of the car, now." And just like that, the silence was gone. The mist no longer felt gentle. The light above sputtered again. Margaret's eyes moved once to the rear-view mirror. The second SUV hadn't arrived yet. The neighborhood remained asleep, but Margaret knew something had changed. She slowly unbuckled her seatbelt, and then opened the door, and stepped out into the night. The flashlight beam didn't budge. It stayed locked on Margaret Ellis's face, an unblinking spotlight that erased shadow and dignity in one harsh sweep. The white-hot circle of light stripped away the night's softness. It was intrusive, deliberate. She'd felt it before more times than she could count, but it still unsettled her. Not because she feared the officer standing across from her, but because she knew exactly what this was. Officer Haley Dunn didn't even glance at the identification and registration sitting openly on the passenger's seat. She didn't acknowledge Margaret's age, or the fact that she had complied before being asked. She didn't see the woman standing in front of her. All she saw was something to contain. Something to contain. Dunn's voice cut the air, clipped and cold. "Step away from the vehicle." Margaret complied without hesitation. She shut her door gently, making no sudden movements, and stood upright on the damp pavement. Her breath misted in the air between them. She kept her hands visible, her voice locked behind steady lips. Dunn stepped closer, flashlight still trained on her. No introduction, no reason given, just posture, assumption, and power. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" she asked. Margaret blinked. The question wasn't curious. It wasn't procedural. It was accusatory, loaded, a challenge disguised as a query. "I live here," Margaret replied, 2 blocks over. The officer's lips thinned. The light remained fixed. "Where exactly?" Marguerite's voice didn't waver. "West Pine Street?" Dunn studied her for a beat too long. Then came the next shot. "You visiting from Georgia?" "No. I moved here 3 months ago to be near my son." Dunn nodded slowly, not in understanding, more like confirmation of a theory forming in her head. "You change your plates yet?" "I have a Georgia license. It's valid. I've already scheduled an appointment with the DMV to get it transferred." "And your ID?" "Vehicle," Margaret said, gesturing slightly with her head, visible on the seat. Dunn didn't move to retrieve it. She didn't even glance through the window. Instead, she shifted her weight, placing one boot just slightly forward, planting it like a marker between them. "You know," she said, voice lowering, "I stop a lot of folks without estate plates, especially late at night. A lot of them turn out to be not quite who they say they are." Margata didn't respond. "I ask you simple questions," Dunn continued, "and you give me tight answers. That tells me you're hiding something." "I'm giving you the truth," Margaret said, clearly, calmly. Dunn muttered. Margaret said nothing more. She didn't explain herself again. She'd already done that. If the officer wanted a confrontation, she would have to create one on her own. Dunn's grip tightened slightly on the flashlight. Her posture widened, her tone shifted from condescending to aggressive. "I'm going to need you to step over here, ma'am." Margaret didn't move. "Can you explain why?" "Because I said so." The tone was final, sharp, authoritarian, and beneath it was the unspoken threat every black person in America knows too well: comply or escalate. Margaret's jaw clenched for a split second. Then she stepped to where Dunn indicated. Her movements were measured, graceful, deliberate. She placed herself squarely beneath the flickering streetlight. Pale yellow light danced on the wool of her coat. Her pearl earrings glimmered faintly with each breath she took. Dunn circled slightly to her left, scanning her like she expected to find something criminal hidden in the seams of her grief. She looked Margaret up and down with eyes that weren't seeing her, just categorizing. "You got anything in that vehicle I should know about?" Dunn asked, voice hard now. "Drugs? Alcohol? Firearm?" "No, officer," Margaret said clearly. "Any weapons in the glove box?" "No." "Open containers?" "None," Margaret repeated. Dunn nodded slowly, like she didn't believe a word of it. "I'm going to need to search the vehicle." Margaret raised her head slightly, not defiant, just resolute. "You don't have cause, and I don't consent to a search." Dunn reached down to her radio, her thumb pressing hard on the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, she said. "I'm on Sycamore and Cottonwood with a gray Lincoln, Georgia plates, male driver, out of state, acting evasive, requesting backup." Margaret's eyes shifted to the radio, then back to Dunn. Her face was still composed, but her lips tightened. "Ivesa," she asked, her tone still polite, but undeniably edged with disbelief. "I gave you answers to every question. I've done everything you asked." Dunn turned, her voice quick and dismissive. We'll see what backup thinks." Across the street, Jim Hartley was already filming. He'd seen enough. His phone camera trembled slightly in his hand, but he kept it pointed at the scene unfolding under the street lamp. He had been watching since the moment the cruiser pulled in behind her. He recognized the body language. He recognized the setup. He also recognized Margaret Ellis. He'd seen her at town hall meetings. He'd watched her lead coat drives during the winter, organize neighborhood tutoring groups for kids who had nowhere else to go after school. His grandkids had received their first books from her at the old library. And here she was now, being treated like a criminal on her own street. For what? Driving home after a vigil? Mourning in the wrong zip code? Jim's voice was tight as he muttered to himself, "Don't you dare." He zoomed in closer, thumb hovering over the send button, just in case. Back under the streetlight, Margaret stood still. The red and blue strobes from the cruiser behind her continued to flicker across the wet pavement, pulsing against the silence like a wound trying to heal shut. Dunn paced slowly along the side of the Lincoln, casting sharp glances through the windows. Margaret watched her quietly, breathing slow and measured. Her heart was ticking faster now, not out of panic, but something older, deeper, something worn into her like a threadbare path walked 1,000 times. She'd been here before. Not here exactly, not on this street, but in this position, the one where composure is your only shield, where your humanity is questioned by someone who has the power to erase it in one report. And she was tired of it. Dunn turned back, flashlight still in hand. She stopped a few feet away and spoke into the cold air. "I'll say it again. You're acting suspicious. You refused a search. You didn't answer my questions clearly. You have out-of-state place? That's enough reason to detain you for now." Marguerite's lips parted slightly, then closed. She lifted her chin just a bit higher. "I answered everything. I refused an unlawful search. That's not suspicious. That's my right." Dunn's expression hardened. "Keep your voice down, ma'am." "I haven't raised it," Margaret said calmly. Her eyes burned, but not from fear, not even from shame. They burned from the weight of knowing what was happening, and knowing it would happen again, to someone else tomorrow. A low voice echoed across the street. Jim Hartley had stepped off his porch now, still recording. "He hasn't done anything wrong," he called out. Dunn turned her head sharply. "Sir, stay back." "I'm on my property," he replied, "and I'm not stopping." Margaret turned her head slightly and saw him there. Their eyes met. For a moment, something passed between them. Not words, not fear, just recognition. "Someone sees me." Dunn's radio crackled again. "Unit 32 en route. ETA 3 minutes." Margaret let out a slow breath. Her fingers curled gently, not into fists, but into steadiness. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to argue. She wasn't going to beg. She had buried her husband with dignity. And now she would protect her own. Even if no one else in uniform would. Even if this officer couldn't see past her own assumptions. Even if the night ended the way so many others had, for so many other women like her. But this time, Margaret Ellis wasn't alone. This time, someone was watching. And this time, the truth was already recording. From his porch across the street, Jim Hartley leaned forward, his elbows resting on the armrests of a weathered Adirondack chair, a mug of cooling tea at his side. He watched the flashing lights paint the mist with red and blue. He squinted through the glare, watching every movement. It wasn't curiosity that held him in place. It was something heavier, familiar, the sort of tension that doesn't need explanation when you've lived long enough to recognize it. He could see Margaret Ellis clearly now. She was standing next to her car, hands in view, posture calm. No threat, no raised voice. Nothing erratic. But the officer, a young woman in a crisp uniform, was circling her like a hawk, not speaking as much as sizing up. Jim had seen that posture before, in firefighters, in cops, in people who wanted a fight more than they wanted the truth. He had heard too many stories over the years, stories from old friends, from neighbors, from people who'd had run-ins that turned sidewise for no reason. Stories that started with small insults and ended in handcuffs, or worse. He had recorded things before, fires, drills, charity drives, but not like this. Jim picked up his phone, turned on the camera, and hit record. The LED blinked to life, and the sound of night filled the speaker. Damp boots on pavement, radio static, a voice raised just slightly too loud. He zoomed in, framing Margaret square in the shot. Her face wasn't scared, it was steady, but there was something else in her eyes, something he didn't like. He muttered under his breath, "Not this time." He didn't know all the details, didn't need to. He knew Margaret, knew her reputation. He'd seen her in church services, town halls, Sunday markets, always the first to lend a hand, the last to ask for thanks. His grandkids still had the books she gave them in second grade. This wasn't just another face. This was someone who mattered. And now, she was being treated like she didn't. Jim shifted in his chair and steadied the phone with both hands. The light above Margaret's head flickered again, casting sharp shadows across the sidewalk. Her car sat idling, exhaust curling like smoke into the night. Dunn was on the radio again, calling for backup. And then came the second cruiser. It rolled onto the scene slowly but deliberately. It didn't blare sirens, just approached, like a shark moving through still water. Jim's stomach tightened. He knew what the presence of a second officer usually meant. It meant escalation. It meant they were preparing to justify something. He stood up without thinking and stepped closer to the railing of his porch. Video kept recording. Every second mattered now. The second officer stepped out of the cruiser with the casual fatigue of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Officer Ray Collins, late 50s, stocky build, salt and pepper mustache, slight limp in his left knee. Jim recognized him too. Old school cop. Not cruel, but not courageous either. The kind who went along to keep things quiet. Dunn barely nodded in his direction. She was still standing with one hand near her belt, the other holding the flashlight as if it were a badge of honor. "What do we got?" Collins asked. Dunn didn't take her eyes off Margaret. Suspicious behavior. Out-of-state plates. She got cagey when I asked questions. Refused a vehicle search. Margaret turned her head slightly toward Collins, her face unreadable. "I didn't get cagey," she said calmly. "I gave you every answer you asked for. I told you where I live. I pointed to my license and registration. They're on the seat, clearly visible." Collins glanced at Dunn, then at the car. For a moment, it looked like he might ask a question, but he didn't. He just let out a short breath and looked away. "Ma'am," he said, "do you have any objection to us taking a quick look inside your vehicle?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "I do. I have nothing to hide. But I also know my rights. And you don't have cause." Collins nodded slowly, but there was no frustration on his face, just resignation, like he had no desire to fight the system or Dunn. Dunn stepped forward, cutting between them. "We'll get a warrant." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Then get one." The silence that followed was heavy, and for a moment it felt like it might end there, but it didn't. Dunn moved in closer, not touching, just hovering like heat. Her voice dropped low, just above a whisper. "You know, people like you always think they're above the rules." Margaret didn't blink. "You mean people who know their rights?" she asked quietly. Dunn's nostrils flared. Collins shifted uncomfortably and scratched at his chin. His eyes darted between them, but he said nothing. Margaret's face didn't show anger. It showed something older, wiser, a knowing kind of weariness. The kind that comes from having been through too many moments like this, from knowing this dance by heart. Jim Hartley kept the phone steady, zooming in slightly. The audio was clear, the tension was clearer. He muttered again under his breath. Jesus, just walk away, lady. Let her go. But Dunn wasn't going to walk away. She had made up her mind. And in that moment, something irreversible snapped into place. Right, Dunn said sharply. Place your hands on the hood of the vehicle. Margaret blinked. Excuse me? You're being detained for suspicion of obstruction? Collins didn't move. Obstruction, Margaret repeated. What have I obstructed? Dunn's hand moved to her cuffs. You refuse to comply with a lawful search. You refuse to answer my questions. I answered every question, Margaret said. I complied fully. I refused an unlawful search. Ma'am, place your hands on the car. Her voice rose half a tone. It wasn't panic, it was disbelief. I haven't broken any law. You're not under arrest, Dunn replied coldly. You're just being detained until we can sort this out. That's not how detainment works. Dunn stepped behind her. Hands on the hood, now. Jim zoomed in again. His hands trembled. No, 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 don't do it, he muttered. Margaret turned her head toward Collins. Officer, is this necessary? Collins looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. His jaw moved, but no sound came out. Firing. I think we can Dunn cut him off. We're following procedure. Margaret nodded once. No fear, just resignation. She turned, stepped toward the hood of the Lincoln, and gently placed her palms on the cold metal. The mist in the air clung to her coat sleeves. The sound of the cuffs being unhooked rang louder than the sirens ever had. Dunn gripped her wrist and pulled it back. Margaret winced, not from pain, from memory. Careful, she said, her voice tightening. I have arthritis in that shoulder. Dunn said nothing. The cuffs clicked shut with two sharp, metallic clacks. The sound echoed through the empty street. Behind them, Collins looked away. On the porch, Jim cursed under his breath. He hit stop on the recording, then hit save. Then he hit record again. Because what he had just seen wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. Margaret stood beside her car, cuffed, the light above her sputtering like a dying candle. Her face was turned away, but her posture was still regal, still proud. The fog curled around her feet, the soft hum of the idling engine, the only sound left in the space between them. Dunn took a step back, satisfied. It's being held for obstruction, she said flatly. Collins finally spoke. Do you want to bring her in? I'll drive, Dunn replied. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, just a breath. I'm not under arrest, she said softly. Dunn, answered Dunn. The words landed like a slap, like a threat wrapped in procedure. As Dunn opened the rear door of the cruiser, Jim stepped off the porch entirely. He crossed the sidewalk, stopping just short of the street. He held his phone up like a torch, silent. Margaret saw him. She met his eyes. And in that moment, without a word, they understood each other. This wasn't going to disappear quietly. This time it had been seen. This time it had been recorded. And this time Margaret Ellis would not be alone. The Silver Creek Police Department wasn't large. It sat at the edge of downtown like a lithophia from the 1970 suits. Gray bricks, fluorescent lights that buzzed as if protesting their own existence. The reception area had linoleum floors, worn plastic chairs, and a chipped wooden desk where two patrol officers sat behind a bank of computer monitors, sipping coffee and swiping half-hearted jokes about their weekend plans. The double doors creaked open. Dunn walked in first, brisk and smug. Margaret followed close behind, her coat damp, her wrists still bound in the steel cuffs. Her head was high, but her silence was louder than any protest. Every eye in the lobby turned toward them. One of the officers behind the desk, Sergeant Lena Haskins, tilted her head and frowned. She recognized Dunn, of course, but her eyes landed on Margaret with confusion. Something didn't line up. "Who's that?" she asked, setting her coffee down. "Obstruction of justice," Dunn replied flatly. "Out-of-state plates, refused search. Got combative." Haskins blinked. She looked Margaret up and down. The woman looked like someone's teacher, someone's grandmother. Too composed, too still. "You sure?" Haskins asked quietly, but Dunn had already buzzed herself through the door toward booking. Margaret walked in silence. The hallway smelled like floor polish and disappointment. Two young officers passed them near the holding rooms. One of them stared, wide-eyed. The other muttered, "What the hell is she doing in cuffs?" Margaret heard it. She didn't react. They moved her into a small interview room, white walls, metal table, 2 chairs bolted to the floor. Dunn removed the cuffs, dropped them loudly onto the table, and sat opposite Margaret, with a smug tilt of her head. "That we're somewhere private," she said. "Let's start over." Margaret flexed her wrists slightly. Her joints ached from the tightness of the cuffs. She ignored the sting. She placed her hands on the table, deliberately, and waited. Dunn tapped her pen on a notepad. "State your name for the record." "Margaret Viola Ellis." "Date of birth?" "October 4th, 1956. "Current address?" Margaret answered each question without emotion. Her voice remained steady, her eyes fixed straight ahead. There was nothing she hadn't seen before. She'd worked in public schools for over 30 years. She'd sat in rooms with failing students, broken parents, violent outbursts. She knew how power could be misused. She knew what it looked like when someone tried to bully their way into a sense of authority. Dunn leaned forward. "Why did you refuse the vehicle search?" "I didn't refuse because I had something to hide," Margaret said. "I refused because I know the law." Dunn smirked. "Everybody says that." Margaret tilted her head. "You have no idea who you just detained." Dunn laughed. "Oh, right. You're the governor's niece or something." Marguerite didn't blink. "I'm the mother of the sitting mayor of this city." The smirk faded. Dunn's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time since the stop, her certainty wavered. She straightened up in her chair, her hands stopped tapping the pen. There was a silence, a thick coil one. Then she scoffed again, forced this time. "You expect me to believe that?" Margaret didn't reply. She simply folded her hands together on the table and waited. Outside the room, things were already shifting. In the operations office down the hall, Officer Miguel Torres sat with his feet propped on the corner of a desk, eyes fixed on the screen of his phone. He wasn't on patrol that night. He had taken a desk shift to work on overdue reports. But something in his gut had been off all evening. When the call from Unit 12 came through, the one about a suspicious vehicle with Georgia plates, he had rolled his eyes. That description was code. He knew what kind of call that usually turned into. But now, sitting at the desk, his phone vibrated with a message from a familiar name, Jim Hartley. Miguel opened the video, not expecting much. What he saw made his chest tighten. He watched Margaret Ellis standing beside her vehicle, hands visible, calm, polite. Then came the second officer, more questions. Then refusal to allow a search, which was her right. Then Dunn escalating. The cuffs, the sharp pull of her arm. Margaret's voice barely audible, saying, "I have arthritis in that shoulder," and the sound of metal closing around her wrists anyway. Torres rewound it and watched again. Not once had she raised her voice. Not once had she resisted. Not once had she posed a threat. He didn't know Margaret personally, but everyone in town had heard of her. Some of the younger officers joked about how the mayor's mother used to call their parents when they skipped school. She was respected, she was beloved, and she had just been treated like a criminal on the word of one officer who hadn't even looked in the mirror. He stood up quickly, grabbed his phone, and walked straight to the back of the precinct, toward the watch commander's office. Sergeant Paul Daniels was finishing a sandwich and watching a muted football replay when Torres knocked twice and walked in. "Sir," Torres said, holding up his phone, "you need to see this." Daniels was a hard man to impress, but the tone in Torres's voice pulled his eyes up. He reached for the phone and hit play. 90 seconds in, he paused it. "This the woman they just brought in?" Torres nodded. "Yes, sir, that's Margaret Ellis." Daniels leaned back. "Mayor Ellis's mother?" "Ye, sir?" Daniels exhaled slowly. He rubbed his temple. Jesus Christ. There was a long pause. "Does Dunn know?" She laughed. Curris said. She laughed. Daniels cursed under his breath. "Right," he said. "Where is she now?" "Interview room. She's been in there for 20 minutes. Daniels stood. "Get her out of those cuffs." "So they're not cuffed anymore," Torres said. "They're on the table." Daniels grabbed his keys. "Start a backup copy of that video. Email it to me. And don't breathe a word of this to anyone else until I say." Torres nodded. "Yes, sir." As Daniels left the room, Torres sat down slowly. He stared at the phone screen, the last frame frozen on Margaret's face as she stood in the flashing red and blue light. Miguel had been a cop for 9 years. And for the first time, he felt shame in the badge on his chest. Across town, in a modest craftsman house tucked behind the mayor's office, Julian Ellis sat alone in his study. The clock read 11:58 p.m. He was still in his suit, tie loosened, sleeves rolled. His laptop screen glowed with unread emails. His eyes were bleary, his mind spinning from hours of condolences and long silences. Tonight had been his father's vigil, and his mother hadn't returned home. She always called. She always checked in. But hours had passed since she left the church, and her phone had gone straight to voicemail, twice. Julian had tried not to panic. He told himself it was nothing, that maybe she had stopped to talk with someone, that she had needed time alone. But then the text came. From Jim Hartley. It was a single message. "You need to call the station right now." Attached was a still frame from the video. It was his mother standing outside her car, cuffs on her wrists. Julian stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. He fumbled for his phone and dialed the emergency number for internal lines at the Silver Creek PD. It rang once, then again, then a tired voice answered, "Osted." Julian didn't pause. "This is Mayor Ellis. You're holding my mother." Silence. Then, a cough. "Sir." "Don't speak," Julian snapped. "Don't explain. Don't lie. Don't tell me it's a misunderstanding. Mayor, I saw the video," Julian said, his voice shaking with fury. "She was stopped without cause. She was detained without a warrant. She was cuffed like a criminal. I just found out." "You found out the moment your officers brought her through your door. The fact that you didn't call me means either you didn't know who she was or you didn't care." "Mr. Mayor, I want her released. Now. Not in an hour. Not after paperwork. Now." "Sorry." Julian hung up. His hand trembled as he set the phone down. His chest heaved. He walked to the window and stared into the night. For a moment, he didn't move. He had given this city everything, his policies, his hours, his family's name. He had fought to reform the department after years of over-policing and abuse. And now they had taken his mother. Not because they didn't know her, but because they didn't care who she was. Julian picked up the phone again. This time he dialed his press secretary. "We need to prepare a statement," he said. "In the morning, I'm going to war." Back at the station, Sergeant Daniels burst into the interview room. Dunn jumped up. "Sir?" He ignored her and turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Ellis, I'm Sergeant Daniels. You're free to go. A car is waiting to take you home. I am deeply, deeply sorry." Margaret stood slowly. Her coat was still damp, her voice was still calm. But her eyes said everything. "You should be," she said, "because this won't disappear." And as she walked past Dunn without another glance, Torres stood at the end of the hallway, watching her with something rare in his eyes. Respect. And something rarer still. Resolve. Chief Robert Holstead sat alone in his office, staring at his reflection in the dark window. The overhead lights were off. The only illumination came from the soft glow of his desk lamp and the red blinking light on his office phone, the same phone that had just delivered a message that would change everything. Mayor Julian Ellis. The man's voice had been cold, controlled, but filled with a fury Holstead hadn't heard before. He hadn't needed to shout. He didn't need to threaten. The facts did it for him. They had detained his mother. And it wasn't just that she was the mayor's mother. It was who she was, what she represented, how she had been treated. Holstead didn't need to watch the video again. The 30 seconds he'd seen, Margaret Ellis in handcuffs, calm, dignified, respectful, while being spoken to like a criminal, were enough to make his stomach churn. He stood up so fast his chair rocked back and thudded against the wall. Papers slid off his desk as he swept his hand across it, grabbing his badge and keys. His jaw was tight. His heart thudded in his chest, not out of fear, but because he knew this wasn't a scandal, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a firestorm, and it had just landed in his house. He flung open his office door and stormed down the hallway, boots echoing on the tile. Officers turned their heads as he passed. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter stopped. Nobody had ever seen Holstead move like that, not in years. "Where's Dunn?" he barked. Sergeant Lena Haskins stood up from her desk, startled. "Interview room, B. She's with the..." But he was already gone. Down the corridor, through the double doors, into the back. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. He shoved the door open with one hand and froze for a beat in the doorway. Margaret Ellis sat across from Dunn, uncuffed now but still composed, her back straight, her expression calm, her hands folded in her lap. She looked like a woman who had endured something and knew this moment was coming. Dunn turned, halfway out of her seat. "Sir, Holstead raised a hand, silencing her without a word. Then he looked at Margaret, and the shame in his face was visible. "Mrs. Ellis," he said slowly, "please accept my deepest apologies. This should never have happened." Margaret didn't speak. She simply looked at him. And Holstead, grizzled, seasoned, immune to panic, lowered his eyes. He turned to Dunn. "Get out." "Get out." Dunn stood, her lips parted as if to protest, but something in his voice, or maybe in his silence, shut her down. She backed away, moved toward the door, and vanished. Holstead stepped forward. "You're free to go. An officer will escort you home." Still, Margaret said nothing. She didn't need to. She stood, adjusted the buttons on her coat, and walked out of the room with the kind of grace that made every badge in that building feel suddenly too heavy. Holstead watched her leave. He didn't move for a long time, because deep down he knew the truth. The damage was already done. Officer Miguel Torres was waiting at the end of the hall when Margaret emerged. He was dressed in plain uniform blues, no jacket, no body armor. His face was pale, his jaw tight. But when he saw her, he straightened up, took a single step forward, and gave the faintest nod. "But I've been assigned to take you home, ma'am." Margaret gave him a small, tired smile. "Thank you, Officer Torres." He gestured politely toward the rear door, the one not used for suspects. "Need to go out the front," he offered gently. But Margaret paused. "No, she said. "We'll go out the front." Torres blinked, then nodded again. He understood. They walked together through the long hallway. Every step echoed. Every eye turned. The entire station had grown quiet, like the building itself was holding its breath. Margaret didn't flinch. She walked the corridor like a queen returning from exile, head high, coat straight, expression composed. When they passed the front desk, Sergeant Haskins stood and said nothing. Her eyes tracked Margaret all the way to the door. And then the doors opened, and Margaret stepped into the night. The mist had thickened. Streetlights spilled soft halos over the pavement. A few cars rolled by. Across the street, standing by the edge of the sidewalk, was Jim Hartley. He held his phone in both hands, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. When he saw Margaret, he tucked it into his coat and walked forward slowly. Torres stepped back to give them space. "I recorded everything," Jim said. Margaret looked at him carefully. Her face softened for the first time all evening. "Then your voice," she said, "might have saved mine." Jim looked away for a second, clearly overwhelmed. "I didn't know what else to do. I saw the way she treated you. I've seen it before. And this time, I wasn't going to just sit there." Margaret reached out and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did right," she said. Behind them, Torres opened the rear door of his cruiser. He didn't touch her, didn't try to hurry her. He just waited. Margaret gave Jim one last nod, then turned, stepped into the back of the cruiser, and let the door close behind her. Torres slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. The ride was silent for a few minutes. No words, just the hum of tires on wet pavement. Then Torres spoke. "I saw the video too," he said softly. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Margaret replied. "You're doing something. That's enough." But Torres wasn't done. "I'm going to do more," he said. "I already sent it, anonymously, to 3 media outlets, and to the mayor's office." Margaret turned her head, surprised. "You did?" He nodded. "Before I ever came to get you." She exhaled slowly. And then, for the first time that night, she smiled. Not because justice had been served, but because truth had started to speak. It began with a tweet. At 3:21 a.m., a local journalist named Erica Boone posted a 90-second video, clipped from the footage Torres had leaked. The caption was short. "This is Margaret Ellis. She's a retired educator, a widow, and the mayor's mother. This is how she was treated during a routine stop in Silver Creek tonight. Justice for Margaret." Within 15 minutes, it had over 2,000 retweets. Within an hour, 30,000. By sunrise, Justice for Margaret was trending nationwide. The video spread like wildfire. Instagram Reels, TikTok stitches, Facebook shares from civil rights groups and legal advocacy organizations. Within hours, every major local outlet had covered it. By noon, national reporters were calling the Silver Creek mayor's office for comment. The footage was damning. There was no struggle, no raised voice, no threat, just a grieving woman in her Sunday coat, calmly answering questions while being accused, disrespected, and ultimately handcuffed beside her own car. News anchors shook their heads. Commentators drew comparisons to other wrongful detentions, wrongful arrests, and the thin line between authority and abuse. Civil rights attorneys offered legal commentary. One clip from CNN featured the moment Margaret said, "I haven't raised my voice," contrasted with Officer Dunn's command, "Keep your voice down." Social media erupted with outrage. But it wasn't just anger. It was grief. People saw their mothers in Margaret, their grandmothers, their aunts, women who had taught, healed, organized, endured, only to be treated as less than because of the color of their skin and the place where they parked their car. The photo of Margaret sitting in the interview room, arms folded calmly in her lap, was reposted tens of thousands of times with the same caption. "This is dignity under pressure." In the hours that followed, calls flooded City Hall. Emails poured into the police department. Petitions launched, protests were announced. And in the middle of it all, Margaret Ellis remained silent. She didn't rush to the cameras. She didn't give a statement. She went home. She made tea. She folded her husband's clothes. She looked out the window and waited, because she knew the storm had begun. And this time, it was the system being asked to explain itself. In the squad room, Torres sat quietly at his desk. Officers passed behind him, whisper. Some looked angry. Some looked ashamed. Some looked lost. But Torres stayed still, because he knew this wasn't about sides. It was about truth. And finally, the world was watching. City Hall hadn't seen this much noise in years. Reporters elbowed for space, cameramen fought for angles, staffers whispered behind doors that were supposed to be closed. The press conference room had filled past capacity. Lines stretched out the lobby and down the sidewalk. People came not just to hear a speech, but to feel the tremor of a city changing. At the front of the podium stood Mayor Julian Ellis. He wasn't wearing a politician's smile. He wasn't there to charm. His black suit looked stiffer than usual. His tie was a deep, solemn gray. His hands gripped the wooden podium like a man steadying himself against waves. He didn't open with pleasantries. No thank yous, no introductions. Just his voice. "Mother," he said, was profiled, humiliated, and wrongfully detained by officers in this very city. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. She handcuffed in public, accused without evidence, and spoken to like a criminal, all because she was driving while black, at night, in her own neighborhood, after attending my father's memorial vigil. He paused. Silence. "This is not just personal," Julian said, his voice rising. "This is systemic." The tension in the room broke into applause. Angry, choked, determined applause. Julian leaned forward. "You've all seen the video. You've heard the tone in that officer's voice. You've seen the restraint in my mother's eyes, her calm, her strength, her grace." He placed both palms flat on the podium. "No," I said. "How many others never got a camera? How many others didn't have a witness, or a son in this office to raise hell afterward?" He let that question hang in the air. "Let's be clear. This is not just about one night. This is about years, years of ignored complaints, years of patterns swept under the rug, years of good people being made to feel like criminals for surviving." The crowd was silent now. The air itself had thickened. Julian looked down, then back up. "My administration is launching an independent review of all stops and civilian complaints from the past 5 years. Every officer's conduct will be audited. Every complaint re-examined. Every dismissed voice heard." He leaned back slightly. "And let me say something to the community watching at home. I see you. I hear you. You are not overreacting. You are not imagining things. You are not being too sensitive. What happened to my mother should never happen to anyone, but it has. And it will again, unless we dismantle this culture and rebuild something better." Reporters began shouting questions, but Julian raised a hand, just one. "This city is awake now," he said softly, "and we will not go back to sleep." The microphones went dead. The press secretary stepped forward, signaling the end of the briefing. But the sound didn't stop. Outside, on the steps, in the streets, people had already begun to chant, "Justice for Margaret. Justice for all." Outside the Silver Creek Police Department, people gathered, not to shout, but to remember. The vigil was called 9 for 9, 9 minutes of silence. One for each minute Margaret Ellis had stood in handcuffs, beside her car, the dignity of a lifetime ignored by flashing lights and harsh commands. No slogans, no marching, just silence. Candles flickered on the steps. Children clutched signs that simply read, "I could be next." College students linked arms, their heads bowed. Elderly residents sat in folding chairs, eyes heavy with memory. Mothers cradled babies who might someday be seen not as innocent, but as threats. The air buzzed with quiet tension, not rage, but a simmering ache that had no name. At the front of the crowd stood Maria Lopez. She wore a thick gray coat, her hands trembling slightly as she stepped forward to the microphone set on a simple stand. She was not a politician, not an organizer, just someone who had decided that silence wasn't survival anymore. "This happened to me too," she said. The words fell like stones into a still pond. "Last October, I was pulled over in front of my own house. I had just picked up my daughter from a school event. We had fast food in the back seat." She swallowed. "They said I matched a description, that I was circling the neighborhood. I had groceries on the floorboards." She looked down. "They cuffed me in front of my child, wouldn't let her talk, wouldn't let me explain. It took 3 days before anyone called me back. They never apologized." A long pause. "About this week, when I saw that video, when I saw how calm Ms. Ellis stayed, how strong, something broke. Not just because I knew how she felt, but because I realized how long I'd been silent about it. How many others still..." A woman beside her placed a hand on her back. Maria's eyes welled, but she didn't cry. She just said, "Thank you, Margaret, for giving us permission to speak." Behind the vigil crowd, an officer peeked out from the precinct window and pulled the curtain shut. But inside, change was already underway. Officer Miguel Torres stood in the basement archive room, surrounded by boxes of records. His hands moved fast, scanning files, highlighting reports, flagging patterns. At first, it had been about Officer Dunn, but it didn't stop there. Over 140 stops in the past 24 months. 92% were Black or Latino drivers. Most were alone. Few resulted in citations. Most complaints never advanced beyond the first review. Some had clear notes: subject emotional, refused search, history of agitation. Others were more blunt: acted suspicious, nervous driver, possible gang affiliation. One complaint stood out. A school teacher, 64 years old, accused of refusing to comply after she asked to call her daughter. Torres felt his stomach twist. Records didn't lie. But someone had made sure they disappeared quietly. He printed 3 files, then 3 more, then 10. He boxed them up and walked straight to internal affairs. When the woman at the desk asked, "Is this official?" he looked her in the eye. "It is now." The television played the footage again. Margaret Ellis standing still, her fingers twitching slightly as the cuffs closed around her wrists, her coat folded neatly, her voice calm. The chyron beneath read, "Silver Creek Mayor's mother detained. Viral outrage grows." Officer Haley Dunn sat on the floor of her apartment, legs crossed, back to the couch, arms wrapped tightly around her knees. The lights were off. Her phone lay face down on the coffee table, silenced hours ago. Dozens of missed calls. Union rep, supervisors, friends, reporters. It didn't matter. The video had already been watched millions of times. Her voice, sharp, smug, dismissive, had already been quoted in every major news outlet. Her face had already become a symbol of everything people hated about policing. Her words kept echoing back at her. You always think you're above the rules." She whispered it now, as if trying to find a version that sounded less cruel, less wrong. "I followed protocol," she said again, out loud this time. But the room didn't agree. and neither did her reflection. She rose slowly and walked to the mirror above the kitchen sink, looked at herself, looked at the uniform hanging from the hook by the door. I followed protocol. But deep down, she knew better. She hadn't stopped Margaret Ellis because of a broken law. She had stopped her because she didn't belong, in Haley's eyes, in that car, on that street, that late, that calm. She had seen her not as a person, but as a threat, a problem, a file waiting to be written. And she had been wrong. She thought back to training, to the sessions about de-escalation, about dignity, about restraint. She had failed every lesson that night, and no badge could unwrite it. The knock on her door was soft at first, then louder, then firm. She didn't answer. She knew what was coming. Suspension, hearings, maybe termination. But none of it compared to what she had already lost. The certainty, the story she told herself every morning when she put the badge on, that she was one of the good ones. Now, she wasn't sure what that meant anymore. She wasn't sure who she was without the uniform, without the power, without the assumption of being right. She sat back down on the floor, pulled her knees in again, and let the quiet return. The vigil was still going outside. She could hear the chanting now. Not angry, not violent, just steady. A sound she'd never forget. A sound she could no longer ignore. And in that moment, with the screen still glowing and her face frozen in judgment, she realized something she had tried not to see. She hadn't just followed protocol. She had followed prejudice. And it had brought her exactly where she now sat. Ashamed, and watched by a nation that refused to look away. The city chamber was overflowing. Journalists, teachers, high school students, veterans, and lifelong residents packed the wooden rows. The overhead lights buzzed softly, but no one stirred. All eyes were on the woman at the center of the hearing room. Margaret Ellis. She wore a navy dress with a silver pin over her heart. Her hair was pulled back, her voice calm, even as the microphone squeaked when she leaned toward it. On either side of her sat city officials and committee members, some avoiding eye contact, others looking ashamed. Mayor Julian Ellis sat in the back row, deliberately, not as mayor today, but as a son. Margaret glanced at the prepared notes in front of her. Then she pushed them aside. Dignity, she began, should not be conditional. There was no sound in the room, not even a cough. It should not depend on whether you're wearing a badge or a uniform. It should not be given only when someone decides you've earned it. She looked at the row of officers along the wall. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't evasive. I was driving home, 2 blocks from my front door, after burying my husband. A low murmur spread across the room. And I was treated like I was guilty before I even spoke. She took a breath. This is not just my story. This is the story of every woman who was questioned harder because of how she looks. Every man who was told his tone was too aggressive when he was just scared. Every teenager who learned too early that silence won't always save you. The crowd was on the edge of their seats. You've asked me to come here and share my experience, but what I want is more than your attention. I want change, not promises, not optics, policy, accountability, real oversight. She paused, her voice softer now. And if you cannot do that, then step aside for those who can. A beat of silence. Then the room rose. Not all at once, but in a wave. First the back, then the sides, then the front. Teachers with tears in their eyes, veterans with fists clenched at their chests, teenagers with phones lowered. A standing ovation, not of applause, but of acknowledgement. Julian stood too. And for a moment no one sat back down. Later that night, footage of Margaret's remarks would go viral. Clips of her words, especially the phrase, "dignity should not be conditional," were shared with the same reverence as a poem. News anchors quoted her, protesters chanted it, and in a matter of hours, it became a rallying cry, not just for Silver Creek, but for people in cities far beyond its borders. The hearing sparked follow-ups. Local schools asked Margaret to speak. Civil rights organizations cited her testimony in campaigns. University professors used her speech in ethics courses. Churches replayed her words on Sunday mornings. It wasn't just a speech. It became a moral watermark, the line between silence and action. 1 month later, in the heart of Silver Creek's historic district, the old East End Library reopened. But it didn't reopen with books. It reopened with a new name carved into a stone arch above the doors: the Ellis Center for Justice and Civic Empowerment. The ribbon cutting was modest. No celebrities, no fanfare, just people. Former students, local activists, legal volunteers, reporters from nearby counties. The mayor stood quietly at the back, flanked by city council members. Margaret held the scissors. She looked every person who was silenced in the shadow of a badge. Julian had said at the ceremony, "This is your place now." Inside, the rooms had been transformed. One held desks and legal aid stations, staffed by young attorneys offering pro bono help with wrongful citations and stop-and-immersive violations. Another had a youth mentorship circled, tables, whiteboards, and guest speakers talking about their rights and roles as citizens. A third held trauma-informed counseling. It wasn't flashy, but it was full. The media called it a blueprint. Other cities began calling for their own versions. Some cities already had them, but never with this kind of spotlight, this level of community ownership. The center had one special room, Room 4A. It was the only one with windows that overlooked the front steps. That's where Margaret began teaching again. The class wasn't large, about 12 students, mostly high schoolers. A few college-age kids home for the summer. Some had been stopped before. Some hadn't, but knew the fear. On the whiteboard, in her neat cursive, Margaret had written, "Knowing your rights is power." She began with calm. They might tell you that if you know your rights, you're being difficult, that if you ask too many questions, you're hiding something, but that is not the truth. The students leaned in. The truth is, dignity is your birthright. Knowing your rights doesn't make you dangerous. It makes you prepared. It makes you grounded. One girl in the back, no older than 15, raised her hand. But what if they don't care? Like, what if you say all the right things and they still treat you like you're nothing? Room fell still. Margaret didn't rush to answer. She stepped closer, looked directly at her. "Then remember," she said, "we do." Her words lingered. One student took out a notebook and started writing. Another leaned forward, eyes wide. It wasn't just a class. It was the start of a movement. Margaret later added guest speakers from civil rights groups, local leaders, and even former law enforcement who had turned advocates. Students created projects on constitutional rights, reenacted court scenarios, and produced short videos to share on social media about what to do during a stop. The Ellis Center wasn't just reactive, it was visionary. They created community alerts. If someone was pulled over unjustly, a hotline connected them with a legal volunteer within minutes. They partnered with mental health organizations and ran Saturday clinics on emotional resilience after trauma. They added a podcast, hosted by youth, called 2 Blocks from Home. It went viral within a month. The seed of injustice had become a garden of empowerment. The Internal Affairs report was 82 pages long. It documented every one of Officer Haley Dunn's stops over the past 3 years. 87% of those stopped were non-white. Over 40 formal complaints. 11 documented uses of force escalations. 3 video discrepancies. And 1 case, Margaret Ellis. That sparked a national reckoning. The findings were presented at the next city council meeting. No cameras, no reporters, just procedure. Dunn sat at the back of the room, face pale, blazer pressed, her union rep beside her. She didn't argue. She didn't speak. She just sat as the recommendations were read aloud. Suspension without pay. Immediate decertification. Referral to state-level professional conduct board. Her badge was requested. And for the first time since the night she clicked the cuffs around Margaret's wrists, she said something quietly. "I understand." 2 days later, at 617 IS Doing, she walked into the precinct through the side entrance. She wore plain clothes, no radio, no duty belt. She stopped at her old locker, turned in her access card, and walked into the captain's office. The captain didn't say much. He just opened a drawer. Dunn reached in slowly, removed her badge from a folded cloth, and placed it gently on the desk. There were no headlines, no press releases, just the sound of a quiet door clicking shut as she walked out the back and down the alley. She didn't look back, because she knew there was no returning to the person she used to believe she was. That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows over Silver Creek, the Ellis Center lit up. Its front windows glowed warm against the cool blue dusk. Inside, volunteers passed out flyers for a new Know Your Rights program, launching in schools across the county. The board had just approved a budget expansion. A new counselor was being hired. More students were enrolling. They had opened a second satellite office in the Northside Community Hub. Margaret sat near the front, surrounded by young people, asking questions, drawing posters, debating justice. And when one of them turned to her and asked, "Mrs. Ellis, do you think this will really change anything?" She smiled. "It already has." The girl nodded, then picked up a marker and kept drawing. Outside, another student walked through the doors, and the future took one step closer. The chairs were folded out in neat rows, set beneath the tall windows of the Ellis Center's main hall. On one side sat community members, young, old, angry, tired, curious. On the other sat officers from the Silver Creek Police Department, some in uniform, some not. Between them stood Margaret Ellis. No microphone, just... They called it the Truth Sessions. It wasn't a hearing, it wasn't therapy. It was something in between, a place to speak, a place to listen. Margaret had invited every officer in the department. Only 6 came to the first session. One of them was Miguel Torres. "Tonight isn't about blame," Margaret began, standing between the rows. "It's about truth, about what's happened and what it's done to all of us." The first speaker was Earl Watkins. He was 72, thin, gray, and soft-spoken. He held a worn baseball cap in his lap as he spoke. "They stopped me in 1983, thought I was breaking into my own shop. My daughter watched them slam me onto the hood. I couldn't walk right for a year, and she never saw police the same again." He didn't cry. He didn't have to. Maria Lopez followed. She told the room about the night she was stopped, about her daughter watching from the back seat, about how no one apologized. A college student named Xavier stood and described being pulled over 5 times in one semester. His voice cracked halfway through. He didn't apologize for it. And then Jim Hartley spoke. "I used to think it wasn't my problem," he said, "that if I just stayed polite, stayed in my lane, it wouldn't touch me. But that night I saw Margaret, someone I'd known for years, being treated like a threat. It broke something, made me realize silence as a kind of betrayal." There were nods, quiet, stillness. Torres didn't speak. He just listened, took notes, looked people in the eye. At the end of the session, when no one rushed to leave, Margaret looked at them and said, "We'll do this again next week." More people came to the second session, and the third. Officers from nearby precincts started attending. Therapists volunteered to facilitate. Food trucks donated meals. Students recorded the sessions and edited them into weekly short films shared on the Ellis Center's YouTube channel. The videos spread. People in Kansas, Georgia, and Arizona sent in their own stories. Some schools even hosted watch parties, turning the videos into conversation starters for teachers and teens. Local libraries asked to screen the sessions. Neighborhood groups formed discussion circles around each video. Some churches used the clips in Sunday school. The Ellis Center created discussion guides and sent them across the country. The truth sessions began expanding, one into a series of workshops for new recruits in Silver Creek, another as a podcast hosted by students. Margaret recorded short introductions for each one. More officers showed up. Some watched silently. Others eventually stood to speak. A sergeant cried when sharing the first time he realized his silence during a partner's misconduct harmed more than it helped. Some even returned to later sessions with family members, saying, "You need to hear this too." The town council approved funding to bring in mediators. The local university offered course credit for students who volunteered. An artist in residence at the center started illustrating quotes from the sessions and turning them into posters for local schools. It was raw, sometimes painful, but real. The pain was real, but so was the hope. The Ellis Center wasn't just a local experiment anymore. It had become a model. A senator from Oregon called, asking how to replicate the structure. A journalist from the Washington Post arrived, shadowed Margaret for 3 days, and left in tears. A mayor from Detroit asked for a blueprint. Civil rights nonprofits offered grants. Tech companies pledged support. Harvard professors requested interviews. But when Margaret was asked to attend a national town hall on racial justice, she hesitated. "I didn't build this for stages," she said quietly. "We built it for sidewalks." Still, she went, not to perform, but to invite. On the panel, under bright lights, she didn't posture. "I'm not here because of credentials," she said. "I'm here because I was seen as a suspect in my own neighborhood, and because too many people live every day like I did that night, calm on the outside, but waiting for something to go wrong." The crowd listened closely. "And we don't need more slogans. We need safe stops. We need community checks. We need training that doesn't just teach how to use force, but how to see a human being." By the time she finished, dozens of cities had reached out. She was featured on radio shows, college panels, town meetings in cities she'd never heard of. Activists reached out for strategy sessions. Rural communities asked for digital toolkits. Meanwhile, new centers began popping up in her name: the Ellis Fellowship for Legal Literacy, the Ellis Youth Rights Lab, a traveling truth van that brought the program into small towns that lacked community spaces. She declined awards, but accepted opportunities. She declined money, but welcomed resources. She told every official the same thing: don't build it because it's popular. Build it because people deserve to be heard. But back in Silver Creek, something else was unfolding. Hailey Dunn had been offered a plea deal. No jail time, a clean record if she completed community service. The twist? That service had to be completed at the Ellis Center. At first, she refused. Her pride stood taller than her guilt. But 2 weeks later, dressed in plain clothes, her hair pulled back, Dunn arrived at the back door of the center. She didn't announce herself, didn't make eye contact, just signed in with quiet hands and followed instructions. She was assigned to archive duty, filing video footage, organizing Know Your Rights pamphlets, scanning surveys from recent forums. The irony wasn't lost on her. She spoke to no one, but she listened. And each day, as she sat surrounded by names, faces, and handwritten accounts of fear and survival, something began to shift. The hallway near her desk was lined with testimonial, photographs, quotes, drawings by students. One quote stopped her cold. "Sometimes survival looks like silence, but silence shouldn't be our only option." She stood there for a long time, staring at the paper. Then she turned and went back to work. At home, she began rereading her old training manuals. Not to justify, to understand. She asked herself questions no one ever asked her during training. Questions about bias, about presence, about harm. She wrote notes. She started journaling. One night, she wrote 3 words in the middle of a blank page. I was wrong. The next day, she arrived early, asked to help set up chairs, stayed late, filed double the usual number of files. She didn't expect praise. She didn't want to be noticed. She just wanted to be different. On the 4th Thursday of her service, Haley was asked to help set up for a community roundtable. It was one of the larger ones, about 50 chairs, 2 microphones, and refreshments donated by a local bakery. She unfolded chairs, taped signs to the wall, made sure the pamphlets were lined up straight. Then she stepped back, unsure if she should stay. And that's when she saw her. Margaret Ellis walked in through the front door, her steps slow but steady, her presence as powerful as ever. Haley froze. She didn't expect to see her, not like this, not up close. Margaret moved through the room with calm authority, greeting students, nodding at volunteers. Then she looked up, and their eyes met. No words, no gestures, just a look. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It was recognition. Recognition of the past, of what had happened, of what had been taken, and maybe what might be rebuilt. Haley didn't look away, and Margaret didn't either. The moment passed, and that was enough. Healing had to start somewhere. And sometimes it started with presence. Sometimes it started with a look. Margaret turned and continued to the front of the room. Haley exhaled and stepped back to her post, hands slightly trembling, but not from fear. From something else. Respect, maybe. Understanding. A desire to be part of the solution, even if she'd once been part of the harm. After the roundtable, she lingered to clean up. One student handed her a crumpled flyer and said, "Your officer done, right?" Haley nodded, tense. The student smiled. "Cool that you came back. Most people just disappear." Haley blinked. "Thanks." She turned back toward the supply closet and caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass. For the first time, it didn't make her flinch. Outside, as the sun dipped below the rooftops of Silver Creek, another crowd gathered. Not in protest, but in community. And the movement continued to grow. The banners hung from every light post downtown. Ellis Day, June 15th. 1 year since the night Margaret Ellis was wrongfully arrested. 1 year since Silver Creek faced its own reflection and chose to change. The courthouse steps were filled with people. Children waved signs. Elders wore t-shirts with Margaret's silhouette on them. Booths dotted the sidewalks. Local vendors gave out water and painted kids' faces with symbols of unity. Clasped hands, doves, olive branches. Teens from the Ellis Center wore badges that read, "Ask me anything." It wasn't just a celebration. It was a living workshop. A stage had been built, modest and simple. Folding chairs lined the plaza. The mayor, Julian Ellis, stood at the podium, his hand resting gently on the side. To his left, Margaret sat beneath a wide sun hat, flanked by neighbors and grandchildren. "Today is not just about what we endured," Julian said. "It's about what we built." He gestured toward the children seated in the front row, each holding a rose. "This isn't a statue kind of day. This is a living kind of day." He stepped aside. A girl about 12 approached the microphone. She held a folded paper in both hands. "I'm reading this on behalf of Mrs. Margaret Ellis," she said. She unfolded the paper slowly, then looked up and began. "I no longer walk quietly." A hush fell across the crowd. I no longer wonder if I'm being too proud, too visible, too black. I walk like I have people behind me, because I do. I walk like my mother taught me, and her mother before that. I walk like the story isn't over. I no longer walk quietly, and neither should you." When the girl finished, she stepped back and wiped a tear from her eye. No music followed, just the sound of a crowd standing. Some raised fists, others held hands, some just stood still, breathing in the weight of the moment. Margaret didn't rise for applause. She didn't need to. Later, there was music, poetry. A high school choir performed a medley of freedom songs. One boy rapped about walking in Margaret's shadow and finding his voice. An elder read Langston Hughes. A muralist painted live, the crowd watching a new image of Margaret take shape. Even the police came, not to monitor, but to serve food and answer questions. Officer mentors helped kids learn CPR. Others stood with signs that said, "Let's keep talking." That evening, candles were handed out. As dusk fell, the crowd gathered near the mural, each flame flickering like memory. A slow chant began, "We walk, we walk, we walk," with Margaret. Local radio aired the speeches. Teachers assigned reflection essays on the event. Community gardens were planted with the names of every person who attended a truth session. The ripple had become a tide. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And that, Margaret had said in her statement, was all she ever asked for. 2 weeks later, inside the Silver Creek Police Department, Officer Miguel Torres sat across from the interim chief. "You're on track for lieutenant," the chief said, "assuming you're with us for the long run." Torres leaned back. He studied the commendation letter on the desk in front of him. His name was typed in bold at the top. "I'm not staying," he said quietly. The chief raised an eyebrow. "You're turning down promotion?" Torres nodded. "Because this job doesn't need silence. And sometimes, silence is what the badge demands." He stood and removed the badge from his chest, placing it gently on the desk. "I'm proud of what we've done, but I can't wear it if it means swallowing what I've seen." The chief didn't argue. He just exhaled. Torres left the office and made his way down the hallway toward the training wing. There, a new group of recruits waited for orientation. One of them, a young woman with a notebook tucked into her jacket, stood as he approached. He handed her a small envelope. "Read this when you're alone," he said. "It's why I left." She nodded. "Yes, sir." Torres gave one final look at the hallway where he'd spent years. He walked out the side door, stepped into the afternoon light, and didn't look back. By that evening, the letter he gave her had been copied by hand and passed around the dorms. It began with, "We need officers who ask why, not just how." And it ended with, "Protecting people begins with believing them." He wasn't leaving the fight. He was just shifting the field. That night, he emailed Margaret, just one line. "I've got more work to do. Thanks for showing me how." She replied an hour later, "You've already started." In the weeks that followed, Torres launched a nonprofit called The Bridge Shift. Its focus, mentorship between seasoned officers and high school students, conflict de-escalation training, and a new curriculum for cadets that emphasized ethics, empathy, and community readily. Local stations across the state began requesting the program. National organizations offered grants. It grew faster than he expected. The organization held monthly town halls, where youth and officers role-played different scenarios and broke them down afterward. They developed a mobile app with a Know Your Rights module, available in 6 languages. They even partnered with the Ellis Center to provide virtual simulations for officers, to practice engagement through empathy. Torres also traveled to colleges and police academies to speak on integrity in uniform. He published op-eds, did podcasts, and quietly advised state legislators on better oversight policies. And through it all, Torres carried one lesson above the rest. Bravery isn't about holding a line. It's about crossing it when it's wrong. Inside the Ellis Center, a small classroom buzzed with quiet energy. Posters lined the walls, quotes, drawings, timelines of justice movements. At the front stood Tiana Carter, now 16. She had been one of Margaret's students during the early months of the center. She used to sit in the front row, scribbling in a wide-ruled notebook, eyes wide with curiosity and purpose. Now she stood at the front, wearing a blue Ellis Center sweatshirt and holding a small clicker in her hand. The presentation was titled, "Power in Presence." "You don't have to yell to be heard," she told the circle of teens seated in folding chairs. Margaret didn't change the world by shouting. She changed it by standing, and by helping others stand too. The students nodded, some scribbled notes. Others just listened. One boy raised his hand. "What if you're scared to stand? What if your voice shakes?" Tiana smiled. "That's when it matters most. It's not about being fearless. It's about being seen." She clicked to the next slide, a photo of Margaret holding hands with a grieving mother outside a courtroom. "Stood beside people," Tiana said, "even when it was messy, even when it hurt." Then she opened her journal and read an entry from 2 years ago. "Today, Miss Ellis told me that presence is power, that even if you don't know all the answers, you still matter. Just being there matters." The students clapped. A few wiped their eyes. The bell rang, but nobody moved. Later that afternoon, Tiana sat by the center's window. The sun was setting, casting amber light on the walls. Her phone buzzed. A message from a youth conference organizer in Chicago. They'd seen one of her workshop clips and wanted her to speak. She accepted without hesitation. That night, she packed her grandmother's earrings and a second-hand blazer into a small suitcase. Her mother hugged her tight at the bus station. "You make us proud," she whispered. As the bus rolled out of Silver Creek, Tiana looked out the window and whispered, Miles away, in Washington, D.C., Mayor Julian Ellis stood before a different kind of audience. A congressional panel on federal justice reform. Cameras clicked, papers shuffled, senators whispered. He had been invited to join a national task force aiming to reimagine policing and public safety. Some called it ambitious, others called it overdue. He called it necessary. When asked why he accepted the invitation, Julian spoke plainly. "Because my mother didn't just survive a mistake, she transformed it. She didn't just inspire a town, she built something that outlived the pain. If we don't take what we've learned and change the system, then we're wasting her courage." He paused, then added, "This work isn't about legacy, it's about continuity." He finished with the same words his mother once wrote. "I no longer walk quietly." And across the country, in cities large and small, others started to walk differently too. Some walked into classrooms, others into council meetings. Some walked back into neighborhoods they'd once avoided, this time with open eyes and open hands. They walked with purpose. Because of her. Margaret sat in her garden watering the mint plants, a radio playing softly in the background. She heard a reporter's voice mention the Ellis Center. Then they played a short clip of Tiana's Chicago speech. She smiled. Her legacy wasn't set in stone. It was in motion, just like the people she'd helped to rise. 10 years had passed. The Ellis Center had grown into a campus of purpose. What started in a single converted library now spread across 3 interconnected buildings, each with its own heartbeat. The Legal Rights Hall offered pro bono representation and advocacy. The Youth Leadership Pavilion pulsed with mentorship, peer mediation, and student-led initiatives. The community commons served as a bridge between city services and local residents, hosting everything from legal literacy nights to voter registration drives. Outside, the courtyard had become a sacred gathering space, a wide-open plaza with flowering trees, benches engraved with quotes from civil rights leaders, and a fountain carved with words once spoken by Margaret herself. Presence is power. The numbers told a story, but only part of it. Mentor, 508. Wrongful citations dismissed, 1,273. College acceptances, 304. Court diversions for youth, 97. Restorative justice circles facilitated, 112. Job placements through Ellis Network, 240. Graduates returning as mentors, 51. Inside the central hub, energy pulsed. Teen interns greeted visitors, distributing pamphlets and giving orientation tours. Law students from partnering universities led Know Your Rights simulations with high schoolers. Local seniors volunteered as greeters and guides. In one corner of the building, a third-grade classroom hummed with chatter. Children read from a storybook titled Margaret's March, written by a former Ellis Center youth who'd become an author. In another room, young artists worked on a mural commemorating protest movements from across the country, tracing echoes from Ferguson, Minneapolis, Charleston, and Silver Creek. A special archive room held court records, testimonies, and personal letters from the early days. College students came from across the country to study what happened in Silver Creek. The Ellis Center had become a living history. On the second floor, a sleek corner office bore a new nameplate. Tiana, Carpo Proclaimer Director. At 32, Tiana had grown from student to teacher to leader. Her calendar was packed, site visits, funding calls, strategy meetings, but she never missed the lunchtime walk around campus, where she greeted students by name. Today, she paused to help a student with a scholarship essay. "You're not just writing your story," she reminded them. "You're declaring your worth." In the afternoon, she led a conference call with satellite Ellis Centers in Atlanta, Oakland, Baltimore, and Kansas City. "This isn't just a program," she told the team. "It's a movement. We don't build safe spaces. We build brave ones." They ended the meeting with the Ellis chant. Stood. We followed. Now we lead. Outside, the newest mural was nearing completion. It showed 4 figures in motion: Margaret, Julian, Tiana, and a child stepping into the light. The child's face remained unfinished. The artist explained it was intentional. That space belonged to whoever walked in next. On the third floor, a quiet room overlooked the garden. Inside, Margaret Ellis sat in a wide blanket chair, blanket tucked over her lap, a steaming cup of ginger tea in hand. She was 80 now, the edges of her hair silvered. Her cane rested beside her. Despite age, her gaze was clear, unwavering. Julian entered quietly, the blue scarf folded over one arm. He smiled, wrapping it gently around her shoulders. "You forgot this," he said. "I forget everything lately," she teased. "Never forget. You never forget why this matters." Margaret nodded, watching a group of children below chase each other through the garden's stone pathways. "I never wanted to lead," she said after a long pause. "You didn't," Julian replied. "You just refused to be silent." Margaret chuckled softly. "I suppose that's what makes a movement, huh?" Julian sat beside her. "That and courage, and truth, and tea." She smiled. "Always tea." Outside, a plaque dedication ceremony began. Tiana stood before a crowd of students, staff, and elders. News crews hovered nearby. The plaque, placed beneath a flowering magnolia, read, "He stood, and so we followed." One by one, children stepped forward to lay flowers at its base. Some whispered words. One child placed a tiny paper crane. Another tucked a drawing of Margaret into a jar nearby, labeled "Messages to the Future." A former Ellis intern, now a journalist, interviewed attendees, asking them what the center meant to them. Answers varied. "It gave me purpose. It showed me my voice matters. It kept me from disappearing." As the ceremony ended, the community choir began to sing. It was a song written during the original protests 10 years earlier. "We walk, we teach, we rise." Margaret and Julian watched from above. Neither spoke for a long time. Eventually, she broke the silence. "Did I do enough?" she asked. Julian turned to her. "You didn't just do enough. You redefined what enough is." She smiled through misty eyes. That evening, the Ellis Center stayed open late. Alumni returned. Children danced. Elders told stories. The flame in the memorial garden burned steady, and across town, porch lights flickered on in tribute. That night, Margaret walked the halls slowly, cane tapping the floor, nodding to old memories in every corner. The chair where she first taught, the window where she once stood after her release, the room where she cried for the first time in years. She passed a bulletin board covered in notes from students. "Thank you. You helped me see myself. I will stand too." She lingered there longest. One crisp spring morning, a yellow school bus rolled into the Ellis Center parking lot. A group of fourth graders stepped off, their eyes wide with wonder. Their teacher called out, "Stay together!" But the children couldn't help exploring. They pointed at murals, laughed at the sculpture garden, and peeked inside classrooms. An Ellis Center intern greeted them. "Who's ready to learn your rights?" Hands shot up. In the doorway stood Margaret, cane in hand, scarf fluttering in the breeze. The kids saw her and froze. "Is that her?" one whispered. Margaret smiled. "Yes, it's me. Come on in." She opened the doors wide. They walked past the front desk into the main hall, where posters of past events hung like chapters in a story. On the walls were photos, marches, hugs, workshops, and classroom sessions. One showed a very young Tiara holding a protest sign beside a teenaged Julian. The children were led into the library turned classroom. On the board was written, "Who are you and why do you matter?" Margaret watched from the back as the young teacher and Ellis Center graduate began the lesson. "What do you do when someone says, 'You don't belong'?" she asked. A hand went up. "You tell them I do, and I'm staying." Margaret nodded quietly. Afterward, the children gathered around her, asking questions. "Were you scared?" "All the time," she answered. "But I was more scared of doing nothing." "Did you know you'd make a center?" "I didn't. I only knew I had to try." Before they left, she turned to the group. "This place was built for you," she said, "so you'd never forget who you are, or what you're worth. You belong here. And now that you're here, let's get to work." They clapped and ran toward the murals, their laughter ringing through the halls. Margaret stayed behind, watching. She didn't need recognition. She didn't want monuments. She wanted doors open. The future she built wasn't a building. It was a belief passed hand to hand, story to story. And as long as the doors stayed open, her work would never end. It would begin, again and again, every time a child stepped inside.